because he has to leave very quickly for a flight to Tunisia, and so I'll moderate the panel on his behalf.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm so sorry I have to leave, but I'm off to Tunis, and my mind is constantly shifting now to the trip ahead, and we're a little bit behind schedule. So the title of the panel is Political Islam and Democracy, a 45-year retrospective. I think that gives us 1 minute per year, or something like that, to cover. It's a big subject in and of itself. You have a great panel, and they will be introduced momentarily. Many of them are friends who I've never seen, some of them I get to see regularly. So it's great to sort of be just back in the room, right? Isn't that just so special? I was going to say that one of the things we haven't done at this conference so far is define what democracy is. This hasn't been yet a definition of what we mean by democracy. And while I recognize that democracy is a contested subject, if it's contested to the point where we all disagree about what it means, that's problematic. We can't stretch the term to mean anything we want it to mean. It has to have some sort of content. So I'm going to put out there a definition or a way to think about democracy. It's not my own. I stole it from a man named Philip Schmitter, but I think it's very useful. And Philip Schmitter and his wife, Carolyn Terry, a long time ago in an article entitled What Democracy Is and Is Not, and I use it in all my democracy courses at Georgetown, where for 14 years I directed Democracy and Governance Studies, the MA program. I almost always start with that one piece. And the basic argument of that piece is democracy is a system of institutions, norms, rules, values, laws, constitutions that basically prevent the political exclusion of any group that agrees to practice politics peacefully. In other words, democracy is a system that excludes exclusion. If democracy and the ballot and elections become a vehicle by which victors exclude the opposition permanently from ever holding power, that's no longer democracy. It's what we call electoral autocracy. It's something other than what we'd otherwise call constitutional democracy. Democracy means accepting the notion that no one can be excluded from the political arena and that everybody has a shot at some point or other at political power. And that means, of course, as Schmitter argued a long time ago, that the premise of democracy is uncertainty within certain kinds of boundaries, right? It has to be uncertain. What autocrats love is certainty. They love elections because they assume they'll win them, and therefore they're happy to have elections. When we cross from a situation in which you have an election in which an elected leader uses his majority in the parliament and or his executive power or her executive powers to impose his or her will on the opposition as a sustained political reality, we're no longer in the zone of democracy, are we? So one can question whether, in fact, Erdogan's victory was the victory for democracy, because he's crossed into a zone whereby he sees democracy as a majoritarian political system in which he is going to impose his will, regardless of what the opposition says or does, right? So I think that's to me, I think, a good working definition. So I suppose if we're here, and I'll pose the question and scoot out of here, I'm sorry. That's great, I'm just going to run and hide. I suppose if we're thinking about the perennial, endless question of Islam and democracy, which a subject I think we've gone over many times, I think the fundamental question here is how and what ways does the question of Islam and democracy play into sustaining a political system in which excludes exclusion? I think that's a useful way. And beyond that, I'll just say, I'll wrap up here. And I published a piece a long time ago in which I said Islam is not the question and not the solution. And you may be familiar with it. It's part of the equation, but it's not the question, it's not the solution. The bigger question is, where does Islam, and particularly in the Middle East, fit in over struggles for identity? Identity struggles, which autocrats have instrumentalized, have used in ways that are designed to hold them in power. And how do you go from that sort of manipulation of identity struggles, which autocrats are quite adept at doing, and they always have in that sense constituencies, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. So how do we go from that sort of game, which is really a kind of mafioso game, how do we go from that kind of game to a democratic game in which you sort of rewrite the rules so you can't exclude via democracy? And the question would be, therefore, how do these sort of identity struggles which include but are not reduced to Islam or Islamism. How do those identity struggles fit in? So how about that for a topic? We can, I think, if we have a good 3 or 4 hours, I think we'd have that discussion. But thank you very much. I'm so sorry I can't hang around, but I got to get on that plane and I got to read this New Yorker piece as well. Thank you very much. I'm going to Tunis, yes. And I better come back from Tunis. That's fine.
So we're going to get this panel started with Professor Jocelyne Cesari, who is the Chair of Religion and Politics at the University of Birmingham.
Good afternoon. My presentation will deal with a perspective on political Islam, distinguishing it from Islamism. To start, we have now, as it said in the title of this panel, more than 40 years of discussion on political Islam. The narrative, the main narrative, starts with Islamically based political movement or parties attacking or resisting a secular state. Since 2000, especially after the Arab Spring, there has been more murky lines, since a lot of these Islamic parties or movements went into the state without destroying it, actually. So what are we looking at? And then the second murky line is the fact that these movements are not only national, but have become global and transnational. What they were in the beginning, historically, if we look back at pan-Islamism. So if I very bluntly summarize where we stand, the question is always about Islam. Is it compatible with democracy? And you have two sides. The one who use what I call the independent variable approach, looking at Islam in its texts, in its creeds, in the way that people carry Islam in their daily life, and how this influences their involvement with democracy or not. And the other one that I think is more dominant in my discipline of political science, which is to look at Islam as a proxy, not really influencing anything. It's more the social movement approach, like Islam is framing grievances, but Islam is really not such an important topic. And you may recall the debate around ISIS when ISIS peaked, I think it was 2014. And the big debate in the American academia with the media was, is ISIS Islamic? Right? And so you had exactly these two sides. No, it's really Islamic. It has to do with the Islamic tradition. And the other side, no, it has nothing to do with Islam. So my goal in the work I have done in the last decade has been to step away from that. And for that, I try to distinguish political Islam as a broader phenomenon than Islamism. So let's start with a riddle. So this is a quotation. When the forces of infidelity attack the Iraqis, they will fight as they wished them to fight, and perhaps in a better way, and then their promises of faith and jihad, etc. And the jihad and struggle is to target the assembly of evil, treason, and corruption everywhere. So the question to where would you put this quotation? And the one we've seen the PowerPoint, don't unveil the rest. But where does it stand? Is it the secular? Is it the political Islam? I mean, obviously, we would think this comes from some kind of Islamist in Iraq, right?
It was Saddam.
Yes, it's Saddam. Yes, that's Saddam. And this is political Islam. So the pushback, I always hear, oh, but this is instrumentalization. but you don't instrumentalize anything. You know, you instrumentalize something that makes sense for your community and your political community. And it doesn't matter if Saddam or Bourguiba before don't believe in Islam. That's not the problem. It's like the people saying, why do evangelicals vote for Trump while he's obviously not a poster child for piety? That's the kind of dead end where we cannot look not only at political Islam, but politicization of religion in different contexts. So what does it mean? So I will look at political Islam not as synonymous for Islamism that I will reserve for Islamic movement or party, but I will look at it as a foundational political culture. And this foundational political culture was built with the nation state. And here it's important that the state is not only state policies, that's the kind of pushback I had with my first work on this political Islam. It's not state manipulating, it's building first and foremost a national community that is not a given. And so what does this mean exactly? It means that we have to step away from religion only as belief associated with a person. And here I am attacking a big ghost of our scholarship on religion that is associated with Western secularization, and we take a sampling of people that we interview with the assumption that what they say on their personal behaviors or attitude will tell us something about more systemic trends. It's important to do that, but it's not enough. That's what I'm going to try to argue with you, because people who are not, that's also the kind of riddle we find, that people who are the more religious, actually, personally, are not automatically the one interested in religiously based political movement. So how do you explain that? What does this mean? It means because you have the level, personal level of investment in the religion, and you have the investment at the communal level. First and foremost, religion is not a personal affair, especially when we talk about monotheism. Religion creates a community. And anthropologists, historians, specialists of religion will tell you that before the modern politic, the communities that give sense to everybody when people say we is religion, including Christianity. This is going back to the basic, that I don't want to overwhelm you with that, but it means that religion is police, not the police law enforcement, the police as community in the Aristotelian sense. Aristotle said man is so unpolitical, it's a political beast. Why? Because it's the only community that is based on the sense of right and wrong. What is not only nice or efficient to do, but what is just and unjust. All other animal communities are not based on this sense. And the first community, Durkheim, founder of sociology, interestingly, all sociologists today never look at this part of Durkheim. Yeah, I know he's a white man, positivist, but he said something on religion that echoes with all anthropological elements, which is the first institution giving social cohesion to a group is religion. And anthropologists will tell you what is monotheism. It's a revelation-based community. It doesn't come for you, me, here. It comes to create a group. There is one God, one message, one people. And we have forgotten that because of our academic history, but also because of the evolution of religion in modern time. And Christianity, unlike what people think, had as much problem with the building of the nation state than Islam today or Judaism. Look at what's happening in Judaism in the nation state of Israel. Okay? So that's every religion, and I can say it pretty confidently. I look at Hinduism, Hinduism, I look at Buddhism, I look at Orthodoxy, you see the same tension emerging because the religious community is displaced by the national community. And national community is based on two features that do not exist together in any other community: equality of membership. Of course, you can be equal vis-à-vis God, but I do not know any religious community that is not hierarchical and distinguished by gender, by age, by knowledge. Every religious community, including Christianity. So what was interesting to me is to see how the reference of Islam as a community giving sense locally was displaced by the building of the nation as this homogeneous group where we are all taking charge for our destiny independently of God. And that's not because we are imagined. Here we like very much Benedict Anderson. We are all imagined community. We are one right there. A nation is about a group of people saying we want to decide our fate on our own. And that's why it's so powerful everywhere. That's why this is the only way you can exist internationally today. Try to be a city or an empire, it doesn't work. Even ISIS, it didn't work. So once you said that, you see that the nation state built by the so-called secular rulers use Islam to build this nation community. I will finish right there. So it meant that to mobilize people, there is no nation. Turkey was created overnight, Pakistan overnight. Actually, in the history of nation building in Muslim land, the secular state comes before the nation. So it meant that a certain number of terms that used to be invested with a traditional meaning or pre-modern meaning are still present, but they have changed meaning, and these meanings have been taught, transmitted, socialized citizen with this meaning. Ummah is a community of Muslim believers. That's a pan-Islamist modern definition of Ummah. Pre-nation, I finish soon, don't worry. Pre-nation, I am a Greek Orthodox, I am a member of the Ummah in the Caliph. That is not the definition of ISIS, because ISIS operate on this notion that the Muslim community takes its own fate in hand, which is a Rashid Rida Afghani approach, fighting against the model of the nation based on ethnicity. Sharia becomes state law. Sharia was never state law. Sharia was the monopoly of the ulema regulating local communities. Maslaha, maslaha, everybody say it's public interest. Yes, today, because the state has taken endorsed, maslaha means the common good of the community. And this community in pre-modern or pre-national communities is plural. There are Muslim and non-Muslim in the maslaha of the community. All this is gone. So the nation state will build a new political culture in which being a citizen and being a Muslim is connected together in a way that didn't exist in the pre-national Muslim empire. And the state is a defender, guardian of this connection. So Islamism as political movement never challenged that because it's a given. Look at Turkey. Turkey is still a secular state, but Atatürk did the job. I'm going to finish on that. What did I do? Atatürk did the job. He nationalized the Sunni institution, created the Diyanat. This was not an Ottoman legacy. At the same time, he pushed away Islam from the public space. But this idea, I am Turkish and I am a Sunni Muslim. That's why Alevi Kurds do not have a legal status, not because of Islam, because of Kemal Atatürk. Same thing, we can do this all over the Muslim world. I have done it. The only country that didn't create its hegemonic Islam are Indonesia, Senegal, and Lebanon. And I would say Tunisia was on the way out of that until the coup, which was very fascinating to me in the sense of repositioning the state vis-à-vis the diversity. Even if 99% of people are Muslim in Tunisia, it doesn't matter. There was this intention that I didn't see in any other country of the Arab Spring to reposition the state, to not make it the only actor in defining what is right and wrong in Islam. So, sorry, I've gone. So what does it mean concretely? Because you can say, oh, this is ivory tower kind of thing, but the reality is I have patterns and they work. You can take me at face value, but we can discuss, it's written. You have to, you cannot discuss political Islam if you don't locate it in the political culture of the countries in which it's operating. So it's not that Islam is incompatible with democracy. It is what is a political culture that allows a religiously based political movement to evolve toward democracy. It's a different question. We need to stay away from politics being only the monopoly of the state. And that's why also the evolution of Hanouchi is fascinating. He talks about civility. That is eminently political. It doesn't mean you need an Islamic party to be at the head of the state. It's returning towards the community. Police. And that's why the question of dignity, social justice is important. Islamic parties lose credibility when they enter the partisan game and the state game. They regain credibility when they talk for the maslahah of the people. And in this sense, it's never dead. It's not going to be dying for a long time. And the Arab Barometer was fascinated by the results. That's exactly what people are saying. We want social justice, we want equality. And the one that has provided this narrative are not the secular ruler, this has been the Islamist actor. And in this sense, if they stay away from the state, there is still lots of hope there. And I stop here, because I can go on and on.
Our next speaker is Dr. Monica Marks, who is Assistant Professor of Arab Crossroads Studies at NYU Abu Dhabi. And Monica, when you say in conclusion, 7 more minutes.
What's that, sorry?
When you say in conclusion, you can get 7.
Okay.
No, sorry.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? If I speak to you from here? All right, cool. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'll just be lazy and relaxed. And Dalia, if you could just throw your hand up when I have, like, let's say, like 2 or 3 more minutes. Awesome, thanks. All right, so today I'm focusing on Ennahda's time in power, its brief time at or near the helm of government. I imagine everybody in this room knows what Ennahda is. Ennahda, whose name means the Renaissance in Arabic, is the main so-called Islamist party in Tunisia. And those of you who've talked to me about this topic before, or who have read or listened to me talking about it, know that I never call Ennahda an Islamist party without problematizing that word, just as I never call someone like Sisi in Egypt a secular autocrat. I'll get more into this as I go, but these words, secular and Islamist, often confuse a lot more than they clarify. Now, Ennahda, even though it's been institutionally separate from the Ikhwan, i.e. the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, since its birth in the early 1970s, it's often seen as the local franchise, like your local chain of the Ikhwani McDonald's, the local franchise of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, but it's not. I want to start by separating some evidence-based versus non-evidence-based, some intelligent versus some unintelligent criticisms of Ennahda that you'll commonly hear, even still today. Then I'm going to talk about what Ennahda got right versus wrong. at the risk of sounding victim blaming, because Ennahda very much is the victim right now, and I don't want to sound like that, but I do want to have an honest analytical discussion about what Ennahda got right versus wrong. And then lastly, some lessons to take from this entire experience. So let's get started. Evidence versus non-evidence-based criticisms of Ennahda. Ennahda has been existing in a pool of disinformation since the 2011 revolution. For decades before 2011, under the prior dictators in Tunisia, Bourguiba and Ben Ali, there was tons and tons of propaganda and misinformation about Ennahda that sought to portray Ennahda as a terrorist actor, as a violent, extremist Islamist actor, rather than as what it was, which was a peaceful, center-right conservative party that just wanted to compete in free and fair elections. Why did Bourguiba and Ben Ali do all that disinformation? Well, because Ennahda was the most politically threatening actor and they wanted to demonize it. So even today, you'll hear common criticisms of Ennahda from the Tunisian left and from a lot of civil society type people that we would all in this room interface with if we were working at an embassy in Tunisia or we were working with Tunisian civil society. You'll still hear from corners of this world, and in fact some of the most influential corners of this Tunisian world that interface most regularly with Western actors from the World Bank and IMF to the US Embassy and others, the following criticisms, which are not evidence-based. You'll hear them say that Ennahda facilitated jihadists fighting in Syria between 2012 and 2014 when Ennahda was leading the government with two other parties in a so-called troika. So you'll hear that they supported jihadism critique. No evidence for this, but you'll still hear it. You'll also hear that Ennahda was behind, somehow, the assassinations of Shukri Belaid and Mohamed Brahmi in the year 2013. Again, there's no evidence for that, but you'll still hear the criticism a lot. You'll also hear a lot of Tunisians say that Ennahda was engaged in wild kinds of corruption, the likes of which other Tunisian politicians were not. Again, no evidence for that. And a fourth criticism that you'll hear a lot of Ennahda is that they didn't do enough for security sector reform, especially between 2012 and 2014 when they were at the helm with the revolutionary troika, these two secular parties in a coalition government. Now, I think that fourth criticism, there's some truth to it, but to imagine that Ennahda was going to be the tip of the spear for security sector reform in Tunisia at that time period is contextually unaware. It's as if you would imagine that Black Lives Matter, let's say they got the governorship of New York, that if it's going to be Black Lives Matter that leads police reform. In other words, you're expecting the victim to be the main reformist that holds the perpetrator accountable. And we know from the comparative study of democratization and post-authoritarian situations that often the victims will be ideologically suspect because of decades, years of disinformation. We also know that victims are not well respected often amongst the security sector. These are not people who, when they come to power, find a usable bureaucracy very easily. And the example I always give there is Ali Larayat, one of the most powerful people in Ennahda, had been tortured, he'd been raped, his wife had been subject to absolutely horrific abuse. He had been held in solitary confinement for nearly 16 years in the basement of the Ministry of Interior. And after Tunisia's first free and fair elections, who becomes the first Minister of Interior? It's Ali Larayat. Now that was an amazing moment to watch Mr. Larayat stride into the Ministry of Interior. Emotionally inspiring, incredible. But what do the people who work inside that building think of Ali Larayat? They've been taught to see him for decades as scum, as a rat, as something subhuman. So there was a real question about whether or not Ennahda really had usable bureaucracy to make these sorts of changes. So those four criticisms that I just detailed, most of which imply that Ennahda supported terrorism, or that it was more corrupt than other parties in Tunisia, or that it had the ability to make security sector reform a reality and just didn't do it because of whatever reason. Those criticisms are not evidence-based. There are criticisms, there's another set, that I would say are more evidence-based. That Ennahda's leadership became increasingly calcified and unresponsive over the years. That Ghannouchi started to threaten internal democracy inside Ennahda in some ways, that it became less welcoming for young people and critical voices. I think that there is some evidence to those criticisms. But often it's the people who know Ennahda best who make them. It's people who were in Ennahda and defected, or who are still in Ennahda, that you'll hear those criticisms from. From people who don't know Ennahda, you'll often hear a lot of that disinformation that I discussed still, and it's still very politically potent. So what did Ennahda get right versus wrong? I think Ennahda got a lot of things right. In fact, Ennahda got so many things right that now a lot of scholars and cousin-like Islamists in the rest of the MENA region are looking at what happened in Tunisia and saying, well, if Ennahda gave away the whole house like this, and their leaders are still in prison again, possibly being tortured again after all of this, there's absolutely nothing that we can do right, so screw this. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of that from the so-called Islamist right in the MENA region more broadly. But I don't think that Ennahda lost, or that Tunisia's democracy got obliterated because Ennahda was not Islamist enough. And I do not think that Ennahda lost, or that Tunisia's democracy got obliterated because it was too Islamist. In fact, Ennahda did a lot of right things and wrong things, neither one of which were really related to Islamism all that much. The right things Ennahda did. Ennahda had, at least until 2016, until its most recent party congress, Ennahda had much more internal democracy than any other political party in Tunisia. And that contrasts just wildly from, let's say, Turkey. Turkey was often held up as a model for Muslim Democrats, but if you look at the internal elections for Erdogan inside the ruling party, AKP, he never won with anything less than 96%. No political party in Turkey, AKP included, has been democratic. Ennahda has been quite a different world. Has Ennahda's internal democracy been perfect? Absolutely not. Like I said, especially since 2016, it's become more unresponsive and more calcified. But there was internal checks and balances inside Ennahda. There was real competition for who the next leader would be. At the 2016 Congress, it was not at all clear that Ghannouchi was going to win re-election as the next leader. So I think that was a bonus. That allowed Ennahda's leaders to make a lot of compromises whilst keeping most of the party on board. That was what my PhD was about at Oxford, an internal ethnography of Ennahda since the revolution. They really did some amazing things. 2 more minutes? Okay, great. They also made a lot of compromises, not just on the classically Islamist issues like Sharia and blasphemy that we've all heard about, but on more important political issues like lustration. They almost voted a lustration law in Tunisia that would have stopped the old regime people from contesting the second round of Tunisia's, the second free and fair elections in Tunisia in 2014, and not voted against that. Those were big wins that allowed the transition to be preserved. However, where Ennahda started to stumble more was in making this pivot between the giveaways and the compromises that it needed to do to help Tunisia's democracy survive in its first stage, let's say between 2011 and 2015 or 16, and pivoting towards making the kinds of reforms needed to help Tunisia's democracy survive in the second stage. So let's say since 2015, 2016. For example, throwing its full weight behind the creation of a judiciary, consolidating Tunisia's judicial branch, creating a Supreme Court. Ennahda didn't do that. Ennahda didn't focus enough on an economic reform program. They lost sight of their vision for Tunisia, and to a lot of average Tunisians, it started to look more like Sheikh Rashid, like Ghannouchi, wanted to simply maintain his seat, and the other leaders wanted to maintain their seat without providing a mobilizing vision. So just a couple lessons, I'll just name these without describing them to take away. Islamism in Tunisia does not equal Ennahda. I think we should all be very careful before we call Ennahda an Islamist party. Nobody should be calling CSID secular. CSID is way more Islamist in rhetoric and policy than Ennahda. And if you look at polling in Tunisia shows that more Tunisians than ever, including young people, are now supporting quote-unquote political Islam in terms of policy. CSID is much more Islamist in terms of rhetoric and policy. So don't conflate these things necessarily. Whenever you hear the words Islamist, secularist, etc. in Tunisia, be very, very critical. Secondly, propaganda dies hard. Ennahda dealt with decades of propaganda, and it's coming back to haunt them. I think Ennahda lost not because of Islamism, because it was too much or too little Islamist, but because it was the most visible figurehead and the most convenient whipping boy when things went south in Tunisia, economically and otherwise. Reforming the judiciary is very important. Not having a consolidated judiciary branch really mattered. And the fact that Ennahda ruled during the period where you had the most jihadist attacks, that was very unfortunate. When people feel afraid but for their security, like when there's jihadist attacks, they'll often vote for very anti-democratic despotism, and you need a judiciary to counteract that, and there wasn't one in Tunisia. So you had a lot of security sector draconianism that only continued until today. And then just lastly, I'll say we need to move beyond the Islamist secularist framework to understand what's happening in Tunisia and the region more broadly. From 2011 to 2014, when there really were some amazing transitional windows that we could have taken advantage of, almost all of my time talking to US or EU decision makers was eaten up by their obsession with Islamism. What does Ennahda really want? What is Ennahda's real agenda? This whole obsession with the Islamist secular debate shaped a huge amount of the coverage and a huge amount of the intellectual bandwidth here in DC and beyond. We weren't thinking enough about corruption. We weren't thinking enough about the economy. We weren't thinking enough about creating a strong judicial sector. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Monica. Our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Marsh, Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst.
All right, thank you, Dahlia. Thank you, everyone. Nice to see everyone again after a few years. The title of this panel is Political Islam, a 45-Year Retrospective. And historically speaking, one of the most remarkable events in the past 45 years of the history of political Islam is this turn to quote-unquote Muslim democracy. As Monica said, this is something that was talked about in the early years of the AKP in Turkey in the early 2000s, when AKP was a democratizing force as opposed to a ruling power. But of course, we see that this is one of the most significant events during the 10-year Tunisian democratic interlude, when in 2016, Ennahda declared itself formally to have quote-unquote left political Islam and entered into something called Muslim democracy. As I mentioned a second ago, many intellectuals within the sphere of the AKP in the early 2000s referred to themselves in this way. We are not Islamists, we are Muslim Democrats. Other scholars and commentators have applied this moniker or this label to other parties and movements in places like Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, possibly Morocco, and Jordan. And so there's a question here, a very simple question. If Muslim democracy is a term, what is it a turn from and what is it a turn to? Now there's two very, very obvious ways of asking this question or forms of analysis. The first is to ask, what is this in terms of a political structural analysis? What does it mean for parties and movements and actors to identify themselves in this way or to act in a particular kind of way? What is Muslim democracy as an empirical, on-the-ground kind of description of political behavior? And the other is to ask what it means from an ideological, doctrinal, or meaning-based standpoint. So very quickly, in terms of a kind of political structural analysis, I think we're going to want to distinguish between movements, actors, groups, thinkers that are either calling themselves Muslim Democrats or others are calling them Muslim Democrats in semi-authoritarian, semi-democratic regimes like Morocco, Jordan, and again, perhaps Turkey in the early 2000s, when you see a transition away from military rule, a judiciary that is hostile to democracy, so on and so forth. Distinguish that from action within fully democratic regimes. And here, Tunisia, possibly Pakistan, but Tunisia may be the only case in which you have a political movement referring to itself as Muslim Democrats that is able to operate in a democratic context. So what should we think about this sort of turn from within that standpoint? One way of looking at this, most obviously, is that it's simply a kind of rebranding. It's simply a way of saying, think about us in a particular way as opposed to another kind of way for the purposes of electoral competition, for the purposes of, as Monica said, the relationship with influential actors outside of the country or outside of the region. But it can also be understood in sort of political science terms as a kind of signaling or a commitment to device to other parties. So it is part of a way of signaling your commitment to the kind of political system that you're constructing democratically, and that you're not holding behind some kind of aspiration to hegemony or to controlling the entire political system. It signals a kind of move from a counter-regime politics, potentially revolutionary, even if it's peaceful, even if it's purely political, to an internal regime politics. It's sort of saying political Islam, with apologies to Jocelyne, political Islam as a kind of set of parties or political movements that sees itself as fundamentally opposed to the existing regime, even if it's not violent, even if it's not trying to overturn it through armed force, to a kind of political movement that sees itself as internal to a regime or a constitutional order. All of that is fairly clear. I think all of that is very much consistent with what Monica was saying, which is that don't really see Ennahda as an Islamist party in any significant way. It doesn't explain their coalition practices. It doesn't explain necessarily their policies, the kinds of things they do when they're in power. It doesn't even necessarily explain the way they campaign for power during elections. All right, so that is all fairly sort of straightforward, but what does it mean if you're interested in political Islam, again, over this 45 or perhaps 70, 90-year period as political Islam or Islamism as a distinct kind of political ideology, political ontology, political vision about the world? And so again, I want to pose the question, what is Muslim democracy a turn from? And here, just very schematically, I do want to identify the idea that traditionally Islamism is an ideological movement that is characterized by the possession of a grand idea. It is impossible to understand the political movements of Islamist parties, the intellectuals, the doctrinal formation, the socialization, the kinds of things that were being written and being read, without acknowledging that there is this grand aspiration to an alternative, an ideological, intellectual, moral, spiritual, epistemological alternative to secularism, nationalism, and to authoritarianism. So it first has to be acknowledged that Islamism makes no sense unless you acknowledge historically the ideological aspiration and ambition that it represented. But secondly, and I want to be a little bit more precise here, what I believe that Islamism was characterized by, both in its anti-democratic and in its pro-democratic forms, is something that I call the sovereigntist imaginary. So we all know that traditionally thinkers like Maududi or Sayyid Qutb identify the core idea of Islam as a commitment to divine sovereignty. But as we see a turn towards democratic Islamism, particularly in the writings of Sheikh Rashid, you see also this emphasis on the concept of sovereignty. God is sovereign, but so is the people. The people is also sovereign. Now, the important thing here is that this is not only an anti-democratic move. It's not only to say the military is not sovereign, the king is not sovereign, Bin Ali is not sovereign, the people is sovereign. But it's also a move that emphasizes, when you read it carefully and when you take it seriously, that a particular kind of people is sovereign. Why can both God and the people be sovereign? Because the people has certain kinds of qualities. The people is a believing people. It is a virtuous people. It is a moral people. It is a people that is morally united around a commitment to Islam. That's what I mean by the sovereigntist imaginary. You can imagine politics being organized around a concept like CSID al-Ummah, because the Ummah is perceived as having a certain kind of moral unity. So now, what is Muslim democracy a turn to? So if it's a turn away from those things, it's a little bit less clear what it's a turn to. It's not about Islamist rule over the state. It's not about imposing Sharia. It's not about single-party rule or domination. But what I think when you read carefully certain kinds of statements, particularly by somebody like Sheikh Rashid, about what is the meaning of our understanding of the 2014 Constitution, why do we accept what is more or less a secular democratic order? You have a number of certain kinds of very relatively deep considerations about the question of freedom. So, I should also mention, I should also sort of pitch here that there's a volume coming out later at the end of the summer by Sheikh Rashid and myself called On Muslim Democracy, which is a collection of 10 of his, I think, most important essays, and then a series of dialogues between him and myself attempting to identify what is this turn to Muslim democracy. So a lot of what I'm saying here is drawing from that. And so what I argue is that an important thing is a historical reckoning with the concept of freedom. And not just the positive concept of freedom that you see in traditional Islamism. Freedom is Islam. Freedom is the Sharia. Freedom is being governed by God's law. It is that, but there's also a historical reckoning with ordinary negative freedom. Freedom from coercion. Freedom of choice. Freedom to affirm this or affirm that. And the conception of political freedoms. To organize politically. To be independent from the state. To have organizations of civil society. Second, there is an acceptance of actually existing political pluralism. Not an ideal political pluralism. That is, well, of course we have the people of the book. Of course we have people that we recognize as non-Muslims. There's a recognition of actually existing pluralism. There are Bourguibists. There are communists. There are the trade unionists. There are the people that hate us. They are part of the political community, not some ideal conception of what Islam or the Ummah recognizes as reasonable pluralism. Third, there's an understanding that politics is a kind of negotiated contract around shared worldly goods. It is not about the application of an ethical order that precedes politics and is derived from revelation. And then finally, the grand kind of legitimating discourse around this is a move from kind of theological concepts like the sovereignty of God or the people, the Ummah as God's Khalifa on earth. And there's this increasing emphasis to the foundational, exemplary force of the Prophet's covenant of Medina, the Sahifat al-Medina. This is the single most consistent claim that the Prophet formed a political community in Medina that was pluralistic. It was not based on everybody being Muslim. It was a political contract that granted citizenship without regard to theological or creedal agreement. And if that was good enough for the Prophet, it's good enough for us. All right, so just to conclude for real, what is this all a turn to? So what is, in a grand kind of 45-year retrospective, how should we understand the ideological significance of the idea of Muslim democracy? And I want to give two simple ideas. One, it is post-sovereigntist. It is not obsessed with the conception of sovereignty, neither God's nor the people's. And that is a major turn because throughout the 20th century, the central concept was sovereignty. God's and the people's, the ummahs, and how to reconcile them. The turn to Muslim democracy does not begin with this question, who's sovereign? Where is sovereignty located? And what follows from that? But, unlike a lot of the popular discourse, it's not just about these cliches like moderation or not being anti-democratic or authoritarian or something like that. There still is a distinct vision of politics. It begins with the fact of politics as a core fact of political life, in which politics is characterized by conflict, disagreement, but also the most important goods of the world: stability, security, maslahah, economic stability, freedom, all kinds of things. And so the idea is that the world does not begin with revelation, and then we apply that to politics. We are always found in this kind of political moment, but it does not mean that there is a commitment to giving up ideological or religious goals. And so my argument is that Muslim democracy represents post-sovereigntist agonistic political Islam. It leaves aside this ideological obsession with sovereignty. It accepts democracy on realistic grounds, on realpolitik grounds, but it sees politics as nonetheless a space not where you necessarily give up all of your ideological objectives because you have to be moderate or you have to be secular, but sees politics as the place to pursue them rather than some kind of pre-political ideological commitment. So now we're in this place where we have this idea, but where does it exist in practice? Okay, perhaps still in Turkey, perhaps that's a way of understanding Erdogan for all of his authoritarian tendencies. But with the destruction of democracy in Tunisia, I think we are forced to ask this question: is there a future for this aspiration of Muslim democracy, or again, like Monica was saying, is the death of democracy in Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, other places a sign to, as Monica called them, right Islamists, to completely go back to the drawing board and say, well, what is it exactly that we see as the foundational, orienting, ideological commitment of politics? Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Dina Abdul Qadir. Dina is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and Director of Peace and Conflict Studies.
Thank you. Thank you, CSID, for inviting me to speak today. I have known Dr. Radwan since 2003. I remember that the first mission with CSID was in Khartoum, Sudan, and upon arrival, we were shocked to know that Turabi was in jail. And so a lot of the people who were coming to the conference unfortunately left and did not attend. My talk today is general, a lot more general than my colleagues. I will talk basically about the challenges that Islamic parties and any really political opposition comes up against. So basically, let me begin today's presentation by saying that not only is there contestation about defining the Middle East as a region, but also the definition of democracy as this panel started, and what democratic transition entails is also contentious. But let us assume that we agree roughly on the regional definition and focus, therefore on democratic transition. A major detractor from forming a common theoretical agenda for democratization is the fact that methodological specialization has encouraged conceptual and theoretical divergence, and that divergence has eased our balkanization into different methodological camps. As one of the famous democracy theorists, Robert Dahl, says, talks about polyarchy, which has limited convergence of theorists, utilizing procedural democracy from other theorists who work with participatory democracy. That is to say, the theorists who are more focused on the informal, non-institutional forms of democratic expression. Thirdly, the political history of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East is comparatively under-theorized. Therefore, expanding into non-Western regions is obviously needed. Fourth, thin theory, and I will explain what thin theory is. It is basically data that is quantifiable in order to generalize the findings. At the expense of specificity and relevance, does not capture that, for example, in Egypt and other Arab countries, social movements have very limited resources and weak formal organizations. which brings us to another issue with comparative democratization, and that is the analysis of informal networks and innovative repertoires to mobilize that are not accounted for. An example of that is post the Egyptian Revolution. The April 6th movement was invited to MIT to talk about how they organized. And they basically, the members said that they pretended to call on their cell phones when they're in public transportation, whether they're in taxi cabs or the metro. They picked up their phone, not having anybody else on the other side, and said, you know, we're meeting in downtown Egypt on such and such a date at such and such an hour. No, there are no studies that take recognition of this informal way of organizing. And this is one of the theoretical problems. Given that social movements and civil society organizations are oppressed and restricted with varying degrees in the region, and that they lack major political openings, it is particularly interesting to observe and analyze how those societies operate through those restricted spaces to aspire and demonstrate for political rights. I'm in total disagreement with cultural exceptionalism as an explanation of social mobilization in the Arab Spring in general, or in the Muslim world more broadly. That is to say, I take context as a central factor in understanding how informal networks in the Middle East and North Africa operate and how actors among them calculate their actions. The implication that Japan and the Middle East and North Africa may share comparable forms of local networking does not mean that there is an essential East-West divide on this or other matters. Rather, it is an understanding that the West may not be as rational and instrumentalist as many have imagined it to be. Second, theoretically, most modeling in comparative politics and political science as a whole is built on the global north, and therefore southern regions become the outliers in what is assumed to be the norm politically. What comparative democratization needs is the realization that regional cases also could contribute to the classical questions of social mobilization and democratic transition. That is to say, the Global South also needs to theoretically be included in our studies of all things political. Contemporary politics are full of examples that currently prove that the universality of certain political concepts is challenged every day. It is time then to be inclusive of those experiences to enrich our thin theories and recognize that comparative politics or democratic transition theories are not unilaterally defined. Third and last, it is important to note that categories like nation, class, and even Islam, like my colleague Jocelyne said, are inherently problematic and should always be contextualized. Generalization then, or grand theory, becomes hazardous in capturing highly contested definitions such as Islam, democracy, modernity, etc. Specialists of the Middle East region are facing what I call a paradigmatic and methodological crisis. Transition theories and post-transition theories have a striking incapacity to theorize the role of local cultures, historical contexts, and national interest groups. So this is a set of problems. A second set of problems is what I call the national level obstacles. And the first that I'm going to address here is the military's role in democratic transition. The military is one of the oldest and strongest institutions in the political arena, yet it is forgotten in many ways as the pivotal cause for change from above by most of the literature, especially in democratic transition literature. Explaining the variation in the responses of militaries to the outbreak of protest, therefore, is vital to understanding the overall course of the Arab uprisings. It is also important to note that with the little attention paid to the institution, and the fact that the institution itself burrowed with different degrees in the Arab world, it also became highly secretive to the detriment of researchers trying to gain accurate information about the military. As an institution, the military in Egypt has exhibited power and economic existentialism. The military as a political player is also involved in regional politics as well as politics with the United States. So we talk about power, and as observed in a lot of the literature about the Egyptian revolution, the army's hold on power is so relentless that even Mubarak had to establish a strong police force in his attempt to hand over power to his civilian son, Gamal Mubarak. Although Mubarak was part of the military, but his attempt to switch power to a civilian candidate existentially threatened the military's power, and therefore the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces SCAF assumed control over the country on February 10th, and the next day persuaded the reluctant Mubarak to resign. Economically speaking, the second sort of linchpin or causal factor that affects existential conflict and the result that to the Egyptian military are economic interests. The military's economic involvement is so entrenched that no political force that could stop them. There is no political force that could stop them. Since 2011, the armed forces have increasingly taken on the biggest infrastructure projects, as is evident just this past week with the removal of holy burial sites and spaces to build more bridges and infrastructure. Another factor on the domestic level is, and I'm sorry for the mistake, it's antagonistic secularism. Although Western liberalism is partially built on the acceptance and respect of others, the observance of pluralism and the protection of both, liberalism in Egypt pre and post the 2011 revolution, and I would say this is very generalizable, whether we talk about Tunisia or Turkey, for example, they antagonistically reject and refuse to coexist with what it views as its main rival, Islamically oriented politics and parties. Quintessential liberalism is defined by the rejection of a privileged class, religion, or national origin. However, secularists in Egypt have basically argued and acted on their assumption that they are privileged holders of the truth politically, socially, and economically. Historically speaking, the liberals in Egypt have copied the Orientalist discourse. What distinguishes those secularists was that they uncritically replicated European anti-Arabism and the debasement of the Arabo-Islamic culture. Their liberalism was non-inclusive of the masses, which is still true today in the aftermath of the 2011 Egyptian revolution. The secular liberal reformers who emphasized rationality and individualism were paradoxically trapped in the cultural order of the other, and therefore could not provide an inclusive notion of national identity and an emancipating notion of political community. The last of the problems and issues here is the entanglement of domestic and international obstacles, specifically U.S.-Egyptian military relations. In March 2014, General Lloyd Austin III, who was the commander of the U.S. Central Command, called Egypt an anchor state. In other words, Egypt is too important to let go, no matter what happens inside it. The best proof of this statement is in the numbers. In 2012, more than 2,000 US military aircraft flew in Egyptian airspace. Up to 45 US Fifth Fleet naval ships passed through the Suez Canal annually. Cutting aid would push Egypt into the hands of anti-Western groups, and neither the United States nor the State of Israel can afford that. This is what he said. When the revolution took place, the United States was hesitant to withdraw support from Mubarak, and although the crackdown on the revolutionaries was brutal, bloody, and internationally televised, it took the United States and Europe a while before they timidly supported the revolutionaries. It was out of international embarrassment and not due to realpolitik calculations that the United States succumbed to the interests of a whole nation. Arms sales and financial aid still continue today without interference, although it is no secret that the regime has caused an unsurpassed amount of bloodshed and incredible human rights violations. In hindsight, the United States' position never changed, because although the Arab world received a disproportionate amount of US funding to promote democracy, it received virtually no support to enhance civilian control of the militaries. The one study of Arab civil-military relations, financed before the Arab Spring by the United States Agency for International Development, noted that politically important role of Arab militaries and their absorption of record shares of public budgets, but it questioned, quote, and this is really important because it ties in with a lot of what has been said in other panels, the rightness of many countries in the region for major programs in civil-military relations. Okay. This is very similar to colonial policies justifying occupation because the indigenous peoples were not ready to rule themselves. So first, the military in Egypt, as in many Middle Eastern countries, has total control of power, power sharing by civilian institutions, or a balance of power between the military and civilian institutions is unheard of. This balance has come about in other transitions, especially in Latin America, through the United States interference. The United States Department of Defense Center for Civil-Military Relations has played a vital role in raising political consciousness and providing necessary information for effective civilian control of the armed forces. Second, the military is highly suspicious of civilian involvement in the economy, and their expertise does not go beyond domestic production and sales of goods and services. However, what is needed for an economy to survive is to be able to navigate basically global economy. In conclusion, I would like to highlight 2 points. First, theoretically, the field is going through an identity crisis. Whether we talk about comparative politics as well as comparative democratization, it is being forcefully pigeonholed to build grand theory, which by definition is opposed to cultural and historical contexts and nuances. Secondly, also analysts are not linking the domestic level of analysis to the international level of analysis. Thirdly, there is a negligible amount of literature on the agency of political actors in the Arab Spring, which is linked to a bias in the literature, namely the divide between what is rational versus irrational, secular versus religious. Second, the arguments used by the secularists in the 20s and the 30s have not changed a bit. The Egyptian liberals hold that in a culturally backward society, the masses do not have the capacity to make meaningful choices. So it is very dangerous to obliterate one side of the population, especially the majority, from political participation and discourse. Social movement theories indicate that change can occur from above or from below, If one does a comparative study of the region, Egypt in particular, historically has been resistant to change from above. Whether one takes Qasim Amin, Huda Sha'rawi as feminist, or Nasserism as a National Socialist experiment, neither feminism from above nor socialist Nasserism gained traction as ideas that mobilized the masses. In examining the history of the Muslim Brotherhood as a social movement, they, on the other hand, gained traction as a movement, and their ideas were popularized because they addressed the real needs of the people: free healthcare, free education, free transportation, etc. The underscoring of social justice lies at the heart of this great divide, because as my presentation has illustrated, the divide between the elites, elite interest groups and the masses is complex. This divide is also based on the kind of education they received. So the power vacuums, coming back to the United States, power vacuums and destabilization are dangerous weapons, as we have known in terms of our foreign policy through the examples of recently Afghanistan and Iraq. But to put it, all those factors, basically, the three levels of analysis that I've been discussing, the theoretical, the domestic, national, and the international factors, all have to click in the right direction. They are like cogs of a machine. If they are not all aligned right, democratic transition becomes an impossible goal. And if we compare that to the United States or Great Britain, when they were seeking to democratize their societies, this laundry list of challenges was not totally 100% there. Right? So for any society to democratize today in the developing world as well as the MENA region, it is very difficult, a difficult goal to attain. Thank you.
And finally, we have William Scott Harrop, did I say that correct? Doctoral candidate at the Department of Politics at University of Virginia.
It's a pleasure and honor for me to be here. I need to start with a couple of things, prefaces, and then I'll explain what I'm doing. I gather that the description of what I'm doing didn't even make it to the program. The short version of it is I'm going to be, the title of my talk, which you saw in some versions of it, is Tunisia Still Survives. I'll explain where that came from, but it's my Jeffersonian prism on Tunisia's struggle for democracy. I'll explain where that came from in just a moment. But let's see, I'll make sure I'm getting this right. Okay, that first image is of my mentor, who many of you knew, Professor Ruhi Ramzani, who taught at the University of Virginia since the early 1950s. He himself had fled from, he had been targeted for death by the Tudeh party in Iran when he fled, and he was one of those people who found great satisfaction and joy teaching at Mr. Jefferson's University, a place that he dedicated several of his books, his great books on Iranian foreign policy. He did 2 books on Jefferson and struggles for freedom around the world as well, but he was very proud of serving at Mr. Jefferson's University. Okay, this next image, which is a little bit dim. Are you hearing me okay? Okay. Okay, good. That's an image of me doing a little lighthearted here. It's the end of a long day, so I thought we just added these slides in here a moment ago. So I'm adjusting on the fly here, and I promise I'll keep it to 12 minutes. This was Jefferson's birthday. I'd just been up there to see Jason Rezaian, the Washington Post correspondent who had suffered terribly in prison in Iran. under the most bizarre set of charges. He was one of my favorite correspondents from Iran, doing essentially many of the same things that I've been doing, trying to help both countries understand each other and find bridges between the two countries. And to the radicals over there, that was not real popular, and he was imprisoned terribly for it. When he was in prison in Iran, as he revealed to his audience at Monticello back on Jefferson's birthday, his wife, who had been released previously, she managed to get him some books, and he's reading a book, I kid you not, on Jefferson and religious freedom from Evan Prison. So there's a book idea for you. We can call it Meeting Jefferson in Tehran. So I don't think that would go real well on the bestseller list. It's not the same thing as Lolita, but it was a marvelous talk, and it was also very moving, and he did suffer terribly, and one of my great people that I admire. Now about me, on the way back down, as I often do, I stop and visit with Mr. Jefferson's statue at the bottom of Monticello, and I was explaining to him that I'm finally getting back to finishing a thesis I started a long time ago, built around Jefferson's first sentence in the Declaration of Independence. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind. In many ways, that's what this conference is about today. Tunisians, people in the Arab world, are saying, what do we need to do to get the United States to pay attention to our struggles for freedom? Well, it's you have a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, particularly the opinions of humankind here in the United States, and that's a struggle that Jefferson would very much recognize. Mr. Jefferson wasn't real impressed. I was excited that I was bringing it to a conclusion. He didn't say anything. But then it's kind of, you see the glum look on his face. But then we moved on to the subject where I said I was really impressed to discover that when he and John Adams, Jefferson was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams, the secondary author. They had great correspondence even after years of political rivalry, which is an interesting model there for rivalries in the Arab Spring. But Jefferson and Adams had a magnificent correspondence, which did include lots of discussions in the last 15 years of their lives about revolutions that they witnessed around the world. I'll have a few things to say about that in a moment. Anyway, I told Jefferson the story that Mr. Adams, when he died, they both died on the same day, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I kid you not, I'm not making that up, it actually happened. They both consciously waited for the 4th, 1826. Jefferson actually died first. Adams didn't know that. When Adams died, the wording goes, and it's apparently from a fairly reliable source, his last comments were Jefferson still survives. When Jefferson heard that, he laughed. He says, aha, see, he was wrong again. But then I got to telling him, I'm using that metaphor as a way that I'm planning on doing a book. I'm planning on doing a book on Jefferson and Revolution then, Jefferson and Revolution now. And in all my teachings of the Arab Spring, and I'll talk about this in a moment, I spent a lot of time talking about Jeffersonian observations on where these revolutions came from, where they were going, what the problems that they had. But then I said, it's been really discouraging lately. I haven't taught the course since 2017. We had COVID, a series of other things. The revolutions had petered out, and then I told him about my great despair over what's happened in Tunisia just in the past 2 years and the past few months. And that was hard to take, and I thoroughly depressed myself. And then I heard a whispered voice behind my ear, Tunisia still survives. And that was, and I laughed. Then it was my turn to laugh. And then it was my turn to cry. Because I'm aware of Jefferson's words and observations on that. And let's dig into that a little bit. First of all, before I get in, what I'm going to be doing is I'll give a series of observations. I can spend a lot of time talking about Tunisia, but let's do the Jefferson prison. That's something you I'll bring to the conference here. And I'm grateful to be here. So many of I've been following the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy's work since its founding. I've used your materials from so many of your publications. Aziz Sajidina, your founding chair board, was actually a great help to me when I did a book on Iran. His work on helping me understand Islam and human rights, understanding the struggles within Islam inside Iran was magnificent. Also learned a lot about his former classmate, somebody named Khamenei. Great person to work with. Another leading light from Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, one of your board members, Akbar Ahmad. I chanced to see his 2010 film documentary, A Journey into America, where he took a group of students around America, including a stop at my university, at the University of Virginia, and he had them looking up at the Jefferson statue, and I'm going to show it to you right here. This is the Jefferson statue that he had them looking up at. Statue that I had walked by every day for decades. And he had the students looking up at it, and he saw the names of God on that. Well, this is just one of the themes that's on the side of that statue. And as you can, I think you can make that out there. It says religious freedom, 1786, God, and then the names of God in different faiths: God, Jehovah, Brahma, Atma, Ra, Allah, Zeus. And Professor Ahmad didn't quite have the story right as to, he didn't know anything about the sculptor who did that. But anyway, I was dumbfounded when I saw that. And I started asking everybody I knew. I asked Professor Ramzani, Larry Savage, I said, does anybody know why the names of God are on the side of the Jefferson statue? And that's one of those things where another reason why I'm grateful for this center and for scholars associated with this, that he brought that to my attention, and then I had done a series of articles on this sculptor, Moses Ezekiel, and his work as a Jewish sculptor, and for many Jewish people in America, that statement of religious freedom was one of the key reasons. Jefferson, when he died, wanted to be remembered for three great contributions: not being president, not being Secretary of State, but for authoring that Virginia Statute on religious freedom, for authoring the American Declaration of Independence, and then thirdly, founding the University of Virginia. For him, for the struggle for democracy to survive, you had to have an educated citizenry, and that was why all three of these things went together. I don't really have time to talk about this, but I have also had the misfortune to be around UVA during some of its darkest moments. Some of you may remember what this is all about. Again, that statue, which had the names of God on the side of it, celebrating among the themes on that statue of religious freedom, you had the neo-Nazis. I had just finished teaching one of my Arab Spring courses in the summer. I had a group of 20 students, including 12 of them from China. Talk about an amazing course, teaching a course on the Arab Spring to course kids from China who can't even talk to each other because they're a bit afraid of each other. It was an amazing experience. But the day after that course ended, this happened. We had the neo-Nazis marching on UVA, and as they came, they were aiming at the Jefferson statue. That's where they went to. And they were screaming, "Jews will not replace us. You will not replace us," having no idea that the man who did the sculpture was a Jewish young man. That led to this incredible confrontation at the base, which I was there that night. And there's a group of 10 students. There wasn't many students around then. A group of students, something later called Black Lives Matter, somewhat like that. And they were extremely exposed and in danger. There was one university administrator there who got speared coming to their aid. Thankfully, it didn't break out into violence, but that was an extremely dangerous. Think about the irony of this. This is happening underneath the Jefferson statue. Again, don't have more time to go into this, but one of the things that happened just a few days later, that same student group, in their trauma, and they suffered, and some of the girls were really hurt, broken bones, concussions, they put together a list of demands, and their first demand was, in the original draft, was to tear the statue down. They too had no idea what was on that statue. What was interesting is that one of my students from a previous semester, a young lady from Jordan, brilliant young lady, thank you, she put together the observation that, before we tear it down, maybe we might want to study what's on it. And I know I went off in this direction instead of the other direction that it was going to go to, but what I can tell you, at least as a broad outline, I'm doing a book on the subject, but there's a series of what's interesting about Jefferson. Love him or leave him, for all his faults, he, in many ways, in that Declaration of Independence, set forth a series of ideals, a statement of who we aspired to be, not necessarily who we were, but those we're still wrestling and still struggling with that. There's so many, like I said, Jefferson observed revolutions for the next 50 years of his life. He was exhilarated, he was thrilled. I think he would have been thrilled by the Arab Spring and by Tunisia, the great achievements that they were able to do without so much violence. But this very same Jefferson, and I could have given you lots of quotes, and maybe I'll do it for an article for you, of Jeffersonian quotes, the excitement that I used in my class about the Arab Spring. But the same Jefferson was also quite aware of revolutions having gone bad. He was a great supporter of the French Revolution, so much so that he helped Marquis de Lafayette write the French Declaration on the Rights of Man. But on the other hand, he saw it go so badly, and he he was perhaps a bit too determined in wanting to look the other way despite all the rivers of blood. Jefferson was also quite skeptical about revolutions that he saw happen all across Latin America, thank you, and he was, you can see all of these comments of his optimism and at the same time his concern for revolution. All I'm saying is from the perspective of we as Americans. We were a nation, Americans I think forget that we were founded as a revolutionary country. You watch the fawning coverage of the greatest royalty thing in Britain and you wonder, what's going on here? Yeah, we were founded as a revolutionary country. It is something Americans should care about, but at the same time, the very same man who wrote our founding revolutionary document in his life, in his observations, was also a guide to helping us understand why these revolutions so often have great struggles. And I know you're all very tired, and thank you for bearing with me, so I'd be happy to take more questions or invite me to come talk to your places. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we're really over time because we started this panel late. If there are any questions, we'll take them right now. Otherwise, we'll move right into the next panel. Not all at once. Okay, great. So thank you so much. We're going to transition to the next panel. We'll have about a 5-minute break if you want to grab some coffee. But thank you, everyone.